Okay, it looks like we're live. So welcome everybody who happens to be watching to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, May the 19th. At this time, I will call the meeting to order. And I'll look to the agenda for an approval. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda?
None from administration.
Seeing none, then I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Just before we move on to the delegations, we have two delegations. Well, both Yellowstone to Yukon. Will we see the presenter, Hillary Young? Okay. Oh, there you are. Hi, Hillary.
Hi.
Just before you get started, I did want to remind you and the other presenters that we'll be asking you to stick to the 10-minute presentation time as best possible. I'll sometimes lenient on that, but I want to leave lots of time for Q&A afterwards. So if you're ready to go, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for this creative arrangement during this time of social distancing. I appreciate that you're able to hear us today. I'm going to begin by talking briefly about Y2Y as an organization, quite briefly, and then I'll spend a few minutes on correcting the record on our discussions with TSMV Properties Limited and the province last year in 2019. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about our interest in the Bow Valley as an organization, and I'll share a summary of some corridor ecology and how it applies to the valley for your consideration in future land use decisions. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Bow Valley lies within Treaty 7 territory. It's the traditional territories of the Stoney Nakoda Nation, Blackfoot Nation, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and Zone 3 Métis. All right. So Y2Y as an organization has existed since 1993, and our vision is to protect and connect habitat from Yellowstone to Yukon so that people and nature can thrive. We are a charity in both Canada and the US, and we work with over 450 different partners to realize this vision. So it's very much about supporting local efforts and collaboration in order to achieve this bigger picture vision. We're a science-based organization, and we use grizzly bears as an umbrella species, meaning that if we protect grizzlies and the habitat they need, then we're protecting the habitat and land use needs of a number of other wildlife species as well. So to start with, we've outlined it in some detail in the agenda package that we sent you. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this now, but I did want to take a couple of minutes to discuss the presentation that was made by Rick Blackwood, representative of the province of Alberta, on March 3rd, 2020 to Town Council, just before the days of COVID and social distancing. So back then, the province presented their recent approval of TSMV's corridor design proposal for the Smith Creek corridor. And within that presentation, on two different occasions, he mentioned Y2Y. And paraphrased, he said that Y2Y couldn't build support internally for an alternative proposal. And I wanted to take a moment to provide some context and some clarification to those comments. So back in early 2019, Y2Y approached SMV in a spirit of collaborative solutions in terms of thinking about whether or not there are alternative corridor proposal designs that might work for Y2Y, not Y2Y, but ecology and wildlife generally, but also for TSMV in terms of their bottom financial line. And they agreed, and we had a conceptual idea that we agreed we would both work on independently and then come back and collaborate and look together. And so at the time, we brought together a group of 8 independent experts. So they were outside of Y2Y. In fact, they weren't inside Y2Y. They did not work for Y2Y. And 3 of them had PhDs in ecology. 3 had masters in ecology. All of them worked in the Bow Valley and knew a lot about how animals moved in this valley. And so we sat down and came up with an alternative proposal. TSMV engaged Quantum Place and Golder, and they did the same. And then we came back to the table and sat down with our proposals. And our proposal, I must say, was not exactly, it didn't fit the sort of conceptual model in an exact way that we had brought forward initially. It was different. And TSMV could not support the proposal that we brought forward financially. We couldn't support the proposal that we were seeing from them because it was requiring animals to move across very steep slopes. And we realized that that is sort of the crux of the matter, is that their view and our view, in fact, most experts' view of how animals move are very different. And so we asked to see the data on which their proposal was built. They agreed that they would look into it, and there was conversations back and forth for the better part of a year in which we did not receive that data. So at one point, they were going to give it to us, and then they changed the course of action and said we should go through the province. And I've outlined sort of this back and forth with the province around a data sharing agreement that TSMV had not signed. And then when it was signed, it said the data could not be shared. And so ultimately, we never got that data, and that is the basis for the discussions not moving forward. And we did finally get that data a few days after the corridor decision was made by the province. So I'll talk about that data at the end of the presentation as well. So why are we so interested in the Bow Valley? Why is it the basis of conversations among scientists and politicians and residents for over 20 years? And it's very much about, I'm going to spend a few moments laying out sort of the ecological role that the Bow Valley plays and why it's important, not just regionally, but on a continental scale. So this is an image that shows the historic, which means pre-European settlers arriving on the continent, and the current distribution of 14 large mammal species in North America. And you can see historically, so the darker red implies up to 14 species. And historically, there was quite a distribution of species through the entire region. Currently, the vast majority of places that have all 14 species are in the Rockies of Alberta and BC. So we're really down, we're in a hot spot essentially of large mammal diversity here in the Bow Valley. Also, there's the Rockies run primarily with a very strong north-south orientation. So these ranges of mountains that run north and south. And within the whole Y2Y region, there's 4 primary east-west connectors that have the most importance in the whole region. 2 of these lie within Alberta. So one is the Crow's Nest Pass down in the south where Highway 3 goes through. And the second is the Bow Valley. And you can see here, this is a good sort of image showing that there's this really clear delineation of the valley through the northwest mountains here, north-south. And the Bow Valley in particular is important because it's a really wide, low elevation valley compared to the adjacent valleys. So it's lush and it's productive, it's warm, it's easy to travel through, and it's also a gravel bed river floodplain. So these are disproportionately important to biodiversity on a regional scale, which means that more species grow and live and thrive here than elsewhere. And it's also important to ecological integrity more broadly on a landscape scale. So the species here actually move out of the region and move across the landscape. So very key for wildlife in particular. And of course, you've heard this probably from me before and from others at Y2Y, but where for all the same reasons that it's important for wildlife, it's also attractive to people. And so here in the Bow Valley, we have 2 major highways, we have a railroad, we have residential developments, golf courses, playing fields, an industrial area, lots of trails. So the footprint is quite extensive. I'm going to just take a moment here to show, so given that the valley bottom is for the most part filled with a human footprint, the way that policymakers have been dealing with this is by creating designated habitat patches and wildlife corridors that animals are intended to move through. And so here where my cursor is, this is the Wind Valley habitat patch. It's a regional habitat patch. Up here is the Harvey Heights habitat patch that leads to the Banff habitat patch. And then animals who are planning to or attempting to move through the Wind Valley and then staying on the south side of the highway need to move through this series of corridors around developments such as Peaks of Grassy and the Rundle Forebay, around the Nordic Center to ultimately get out to the Banff habitat patch. And this here, number 7, is the Grassy Lake habitat patch. So we've got this long stretch of corridor connecting a regional habitat patch to the
Lake habitat.
Sorry?
That's the Quarry Lake habitat patch, isn't it?
Did I say Grassy?
Yeah.
You're correct. Yes, Quarry Lake. So I'll spend a moment just on optimal corridor design. And it's tricky. It's tricky. There is no formula for corridor design, and it's ever evolving. This is where the science is continually changing. But what we do know is that they should be relatively flat, relatively wide, straight, and secure. So flat is especially pertinent in the Bow Valley, where we have a lot of steeper terrain. But studies have shown, Dr. Adam Ford in 2016 did a review that showed that of all the animal tracks depicting movement here in the Bow Valley that he could find, 90% of all species animal movement happen in the valley on slopes that were under 20 degrees. And in fact, 80% of all of these tracks happen on slopes that were under 15 degrees. So generally quite flat. The question of wide is, there's no consensus on how wide yet at this stage. In the absence of comprehensive data-driven study on corridor width in the Bow Valley, we have to rely on expert opinion. And expert opinion, having spoken with some wildlife corridor ecologists and also people here in the Valley and also looking at the BCAG guidelines, expert opinion says that for a corridor, the length of the Smith Creek corridor, we should be talking about 850 to 1,000 meters. So straight, a small number of short pinch points is okay. But again, it should, and we know that animals will travel, for example, across overpasses and underpasses. So if it's short, pinch points are okay. But generally speaking, we want to keep the width fairly consistent and secure. So the management of human use is essential, and that can be by a number of tools. First and foremost are probably education and enforcement. So this is a map from that we created in 2017. So it's not up to date. It shows, and it's not exact, but it's good for sort of a conceptual overview. And what we've done here, given that slope is important, we created a 25-degree slope line. So a line that minimized the number of 25-degree slopes within the corridor itself. And then we created a buffer of 450 meters, which is less than experts say is required, but is a more practical value given how narrow the strip of land that we're talking about is. And I just wanted to show this in order to show how much room animals need through this area and how little that would leave for development if wildlife had the room and space that they needed. So again, this is in fact quite a little bit wider than is shown here, but it gives you a clear sense of what we're talking about, that gray buffer there. This map we developed this year. And so what we have here in blue is the outline of the newly approved corridor made by the province. It's a shapefile that we that is actually the province's shapefile. And adjacent to it in this purpley red color is the province's own slope line that they developed in 2017, 2018. Their slope line fell sort of intermediate between Y-to-Y slope line and the slope line that TSMV developed. And what this shows is that all of these slopes in here, so anything that is light in this case is steep. And it shows that we've got quite a bit of steep slopes in the approved corridor. And what remains are these pinch points through here. Here's one, and here's another over here. And I can show you, there we go, a little bit more clearly, these pinch points that are created by all of these deeper areas that are actually falling right within the corridor. So animals coming through here would actually, if the footprint was developed all the way up to this line, so if this was developed in here, you would have animals moving quite close to human developments, if in fact they were going to move through it all, and I can talk about that in a moment. One thing that was good about the approved corridor is that they did in fact widen this across valley corridor, so we were happy to see that. This is still problematic, this tight sort of corner pinch point here that leads to the existing underpass. There may be a few elk that would use it, but all in all, it won't be terribly functional. But this is an improvement over the last round. So following the announcement, we sat down in the weeks later with some provincial representatives and talked about the factors that went into their decision making. And one of the things that we learned is that they considered flight initiation distance for wolves as a good way to think about the minimum width for the corridor. So a little overview on what flight initiation distance is. If you have if you have a human moving along a path, the flight initiation distance is the distance at which wildlife will respond or move away from that human on average. And so these are averages, of course, they're not absolutes. For bears, it's about 200 meters. So if a bear is 200 meters from a person, it'll flee on average. Wolves, it's on average 400 meters, and elk, I know this sounds hard to believe because we're so used to habituated elk, but unhabituated within forested areas, it's 800 meters. And so the province said, okay, let's take the middle number. We're going to look at wolves. We're going to say 400 meters is going to be our minimum distance. And the challenge of that, of course, is that if you have a minimum of 400 meters across a corridor, and then you have a person moving alongside the corridor, say on the other side, the effective corridor width for a wolf will be 0 at that point because it won't actually use the corridor at all. It seems highly problematic, in fact, that would have been used as a minimum corridor width.
Dr. Young, I'm just going to interrupt briefly. We're 15 minutes in, and we do want to leave time for some questions. So
let me speed it up then, and I think I'm almost there.
Thank you.
Right, this is the last thing I just wanted to chat about quickly. So of course, this is just an additional complication that we have. This is the future growth boundary line for the town. The NRCB decision applies to the lands west of this line, and it does not apply to the lands east of this line. And in fact, that means that the BCAG guidelines, which the town has, takes into consideration generally, could in fact be applied to the lands outside of that line. Okay, in the interest of going quickly, we've looked at TSMV's data. I could easily send the council a summary or the report itself. We actually got a third-party consultant to review it. Long story short is that it doesn't show us anything different about how animals move on steep slopes. It shows that all species prefer to move on shallow slopes, which is very much what we have all thought all along. And finally, I just wanted to end with letting you know that we're here to help. We're happy to talk about this. We hope that you take this information into consideration as you are considering any new land use proposals for the Smith Creek lands and the resort center lands as well. So I'll leave it at that, recognizing that time's an issue.
Well, thanks very much for being here and giving us the Y2Y overview on the the provincial decision. That's very helpful to have. I expect there's some questions from members of council. I have a question actually that's sparked by the development timeline that you included in your report to council.
Right.
And it's specifically in regards to the your note in 2000 Herrero Jevons report applies the BCA guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. And the report conclude that the corridors consistently fail to meet the minimum standards for functional viable corridors set by BCA. And he goes on to say this failure has the potential to severely impair the movement of wildlife in the Bow Valley between the Kananaskis and Banff National Park. So that was 20 years ago. I'm just curious, in more recent studies of wildlife movement, is that caution that was expressed in 2020 or in 2000, where are we in the real world in regards to that note of caution that was expressed in the year 2000?
Right. That's a great question. I don't have all the information on exactly the current status of grizzly bears in the valley, but I can say that of the, so the TSMV had over 1,300 cameras out, wildlife cameras out over, I think up to a year, some of these data, the cameras collected data for, and they were, that's from the Smith Creek Lands, Wind Valley, all the way over to Peaks of Grassy. And of, all the images collected, only 34 were of grizzly bears. And so, the seasonality is an issue. They're obviously not out in the winter. But also it's very possibly a sign that we don't have that many moving through the valley currently. And so it's possible that we have less movement. We have received, or over the last 20 years, there's been less movement of grizzly bears during that time. I'd have to look into it more, but it struck me that we only had 34 images.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah, I'm really curious, now that we've moved along the continuum by a couple of decades, how things are playing out on the ground in regards to what has happened in the valley since that time.
Mm-hmm. I could certainly talk to some parks ecologists too and get you more information.
That'd be helpful at some point. Thank you. Looking to the rest of council. Councillor Mara, you have a question? You can mute yourself, or there you
go. Thank you, Ms. Young, for your presentation. I did have a question regarding the 400 meters. When an animal, it's also been referred to as a freak out point, I think it's called, where they turn around, Adam's verbiage.
That's right.
And they back up. And what happens when they start going in that direction? Does it sort of unbalance, or what's the?
It's a great question. So that it could be many different effects. It could be that it turns around and goes in a different direction entirely. It could be that it disrupts its movement path, but is able to find its way back, but its path ends up being longer because it's been disrupted. One of the factors that needs to be examined more, Adam Ford recognized this in his study, is the strength of the response. So we know that there's a response. We don't know if it's what the strength is. Is it actually going to be scared off and go off and not come back, or is it going to come back eventually over time?
Thank you.
One other question I have, which is really not that material, just for my own sake of my own memory, in the timeline, the very first entrance in the timeline you provided was 89, and it references the Three Sisters, the ownership at the time, exploring concept of 2,800 acre development in the Wind Valley. My recollection was there was only about 500 acres of their property in the Wind Valley, and the remaining 2,300 or whatever were all in the Bow Valley. Do you?
Yes. So great question. Thank you. And that was brought to our attention after I sent that in, and we've been trying to find the details, and I haven't actually found them. We did see something about 25% of the development being proposed in the Wind Valley, and then 75 being proposed in the Bow Valley. It was unclear to us whether the land exchange because they couldn't develop in the Wind Valley was a part of that or not. So I can clarify that point too.
Okay, it really isn't that germane, but
Well, no, it's a good point though.
yeah,
We'd like to be precise.
thank you. Councillor Sanford, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Borman, and thank you, Hilary Young, for your presentation. I had a question for you regarding the slope. Is there any kind of mitigation that could be done in the corridor along that sloped area? For instance, some vegetation thinning and maybe some food attractants, or is there any way to make the slope more attractive?
I've never thought about making the slope more attractive. That's an interesting point. We've certainly talked about making the corridor more attractive generally to attract animals away from the development that's adjacent and keep them in the corridor itself. It would be a great question to know whether the energetic cost of moving on steeper slopes could be balanced or outweighed by additional vegetation and food, because that is one of the challenges, is that when they're up on the steep slopes, there's less to eat. They're expending more energy and there's less to eat. So that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, there had been some suggestions in the past about creating food attractant zones outside of where we want animals to be. But I mean, it's highly theoretical, I suppose. But the slope that we're talking about actually it is a vegetated slope, right? It's not a rocky slope.
Some of these are rockier. Some 25-degree slope is like a black diamond ski run. So some of them are quite rocky.
But there is vegetation on that sloped area that we're talking about right now?
Well, we're not talking about one particular sloped area. It's a number of discontinuous slopes. So the different slopes have different properties.
Okay, I thought we were talking about the one that's most adjacent to the corridor or within the corridor.
Right. Well, down at the very east end, they're discontinuous in the sense that there are a few here and there. And so some of those are certainly vegetated. Other places, it's a bit rockier.
Okay, thank you.
That was an interesting comparison there, the 25-degree slope being equivalent to average black diamond ski run. I had never had it put in that context to me. So
Yeah.
Councillor McCallum, you have a question.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I agree. That was actually like, oh, that's what 25 degrees looks like, because I don't go down those hills. Thank you, Dr. Young, for your presentation. One question I had actually was within the synopsis of time that you'd provided us, and in particular, when I had it and now I lost it. Sorry. During the collaborative ASP process, I note that you state that, or it's stated in the report that Dr. Hauer or Mr. Hauer stepped aside or resigned from the collaborative ASP project, and that he was the only conservationist on the committee. But I believe that Pat Kamenka was on that committee as well, and is also
Yes.
a well-known local conservationist.
I think that the word conservationist was used to represent someone from the paid community. And I think of Pat Kamenka as an ecologist or someone who does ecology work.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. The other question I had was, after you received the data 3 days after they'd made their decision, I'm guessing that you've gone back to speak to them about what has happened and then your unhappiness with the process. They certainly have heard from members of council on that. What was the response from the province?
About the data? Well,
about the change in direction as to how they were approaching their decision making, I guess.
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean about the data that we received from the province, or about the fact that the second time around the approval was quite different? Both.
They're interconnected.
Yeah, well, I've been speaking with different provincial representatives about different things. So the representative who finally got the data to me is local and was not involved in the actual decision-making process, although he had permission to share the data in the end. Those who were responsible for the decision, in one case, Rick Blackwood retired on the Friday after he made the decision. I think everyone knows that. Rob Stimrich is now a new decision maker who is sort of seeing it through.
Mhm.
And you know, I won't speak for him, but he certainly is. He didn't make the decision. He's now representing the decision. Maybe that's the fairest way to say it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And is there any, if Y2Y wanted to take this any further, is there any process that they could appeal to the province on this decision?
My understanding is no, and that's because this is a decision that was made, the approval was given in 1992, and this was a condition of the 1992
Approval.
approval. So we can't actually appeal it, as I understand.
Okay. All right. Those were my questions. Thank you.
Quick question then, Councillor Seeley, we should be moving on to the next delegation.
Thank you, Mayor Borman, and thank you for your presentation, Ms. Young. Just wondering about the 3 pinch points that you talked about. Do you have any remedies that you might recommend?
It's a great question. We're just starting to think about creative solutions that would help achieve sort of the triple bottom line in terms of the social, economic, and ecological values that the town has. I think that's the next phase, is to start thinking creatively about how to achieve a development that still allows wildlife to move through the area. So we're in the early phases of starting to think in that way.
Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Dr. Young. I do have one subject I wanted to bring up since we had you in front of council, and this is in regards to human wildlife coexistence project that we have going, and is seeing some controversy in the town, specifically talking about the controversy surrounding the town's project at the Quarry Lake off-leash area, which is intended to reduce the incursion into the Quarry Lake habitat patch of dogs off leash. So in your perspective, how important to the wildlife connectivity are the habitat patches, and particularly of the Quarry Lake habitat patch in general?
Right. So you'll recall in that map that the Quarry Lake habitat patch is the first local habitat patch after that long series of corridors that connect to the Wind Valley Regional Habitat Patch. So the idea of habitat patches is that they give wildlife rest and respite, and moving through a corridor, it may not actually be it might be a stressful experience. And so the idea is to reach a habitat patch and actually have time to recuperate. And so if a habitat patch is in fact filled with people, it's not a secure habitat patch. And then there's a people management issue. So scientifically speaking, it's best to have a habitat patch that's actually going to function for wildlife. And that Quarry Lake habitat patch is a key patch.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And thanks for being here with us this afternoon, Dr. Young.
Thanks very much for having me. And yeah, you'll hear from Adam.
That's right. And I'll welcome, is Adam going to speak first? Adam Leonard, Mr. Leonard.
Yeah, I'll go first. Thank you. And thanks everybody for having us this afternoon in these obviously strange circumstances. So this is a bit of a hard shift now, totally separate thing. It's all like refresh our minds and we're doing something different now. So my portion of this afternoon's meeting is going to be really brief so that we can hear as much as possible from Matt Carlson, who's an ecologist and a modeler with the ALCES group. He's joining us from Ottawa today. But Y2Y is undertaking a future scenarios cumulative effects modeling effort with ALCES. I will share that. I'm just going to quickly share the screen. We're taking the same study area as the Human Wildlife Coexistence Working Group did. So Castle Junction down to the Kananaskis River. The future scenarios modeling uses the best available data, plans, and estimates for the past, present, and future of that study area to map out a number of scenarios for if this were to, or if this happens, then this would be the likely outcome for this issue of concern to the study group. So Matt's going to discuss the technical details of that modeling process, and he's going to focus on the indicator that Y2Y has put forward, which is grizzly bear movement, which I'm sure will surprise none of you. So for grizzly bears, we might say if Alberta Transportation builds these highway crossing structures in these locations, what would that mean for grizzly bears moving through the valley over the next 30 years? In that example, the potential highway crossing structures represent a scenario, something that we might do in the landscape, and grizzly bear movement represents an indicator, so something that would be impacted by that scenario. Now, for the past year or so, Y2Y has been exploring the possibility of forming an advisory group to inform this work. And particularly in an effort to make sure that the work is as accurate as possible and as useful as possible to the different jurisdictions who do land use planning in the valley. We've been working with the goal of an advisory group that's made up of the valley jurisdictions, following, again, the human-wildlife coexistence example. So we've met with staff or representatives from the town of Canmore, the town of Banff, Parks Canada, Alberta Parks, and the MD of Bighorn over the past year. Now, the purpose of that advisory group would be to inform the scenarios that I described as accurately as possible with data and plans and projections, as well as to potentially bring forward an additional 2 or 3 indicators along with the grizzly bear movement. Those could be environmental. They could also be socioeconomic, depending on the needs of the jurisdiction, but also contingent on the feasibility of the modeler to execute. That advisory group would meet ideally about or fewer than a half dozen times before the end of this year. Perhaps early 2021, there would be additional asks for input or clarification on an informal basis. Final report is ideally prepared for summer 2021 by ALCES. That report would be centered on these maps that Matt will show you. It's not a suite of recommendations, it's a suite of information to inform land use planning within the valley. We know right now, obviously, governments are really focused on COVID-19, rightfully so. Not all of them are taking meetings or conversations or advancing work that is not related to the pandemic. So the makeup of our advisory group might have to shift. We might not have much of a choice there, in which case we would focus on diverse community groups that might include recreation, business, and other civil society groups here in the valley who could inform this process. Either way, we would like council to consider directing a small amount of staff time to an advisory group to make sure that this modeling is as valuable to the town of Canmore as possible. So thank you. That's my bit, and I'll let Matt talk about his modeling process and the outputs that we would be able to expect.
Great. Just before Matt starts up, I wonder, so the advisory group that you just detailed, Mr. Leonard, is it's meeting now. It's in existence now.
No. It's, as I said, we were hoping to sort of put it together with representatives from the different towns and governments,
Right.
and so it's been delayed a little bit.
Okay.
So it is not meeting right now. It would be facilitated by a third-party facilitator.
And have you got indications from all of those different parties, municipal parties in the parks and both federal and provincial, that they will take part in the advisory group?
There was interest from all of them. Everyone was positive. Right now, it's more a question of their councils or governing bodies having the time and priority to focus on anything that's not pandemic. So I know in different places, right, we would want to present to council to have council understand the process and allocate some staff time. The councils right now aren't meeting on anything other than COVID. So we haven't been able to present formally to councils yet.
Okay, appreciate that. And just one last question. How effective would this process be if all of those parties were not involved?
I think that's up to the municipalities ultimately, because it's up to them, like their planning departments to take it seriously. So we do want the input from the municipalities. A lot of the information I understand is public already. If you have a, if you have a development plan, it's public, so we know where it is. But we do want to make sure, so that's the scenarios. The scenarios we can, we can come up with ourselves, but we want to make sure that those scenarios reflect the priorities of town so that they are as useful to the town as possible. And those indicators. So obviously Y2Y really cares first and foremost about grizzly bear movement. Some of the socioeconomic indicators could include things like travel time in a vehicle. So if you develop a particular transportation plan, how would that affect your ability to get from, Stewart Creek to downtown? Just as an example, I don't know the feasibility of that exactly, but
Right. And maybe my next question is better for Mr. Carlson, but you didn't reference the Stony Nakota in the potential participants of the advisory group. And is there, I mean, I understand that they have a well-respected body of traditional knowledge. So have you reached out to Stony Nakota or?
yes, we have, and we have for many years, and on different things, it's been more successful than others. There hasn't been an indication at this time that there's the capacity or interest in participating. So I don't want to include them like within a presentation like this. We will certainly keep them informed as the thing progresses, and at any point, if at any point they have interest in participating, we would explore that for sure.
Okay, thanks very much. And now I'll welcome Mr. Carlson to speak to council.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. Okay, can people see my presentation? Okay, great. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to be with you today to provide an introduction to the project that Adam was referring to. Just going to go into a little bit more detail in the analysis that we're undertaking. The intent of the project is to assess the cumulative effects of land use footprints and also human activity on wildlife connectivity in the Bow Valley, with a focus on grizzly bears. And in addition to assessing the effect of past, current, and potential future land use on grizzly bears connectivity, the intent is to explore the effectiveness of mitigation strategies that would be identified by the advisory committee that Adam referred to. And the objective here is to inform strategic planning and support of human-wildlife coexistence in the valley, building upon other efforts that are ongoing in the region. Cumulative effects are incremental disturbances that individually, while small, can accumulate over space and time to potentially cause large impacts to the environment. And if this has been referred to as the tyranny of small decisions, and it's responsible for many of the environmental issues that we have today. And if planning is focused solely on individual projects or developments, it can miss the potential for individual projects to accumulate over time and cause large impacts. So addressing cumulative effects really requires consideration of larger spatial and temporal scales while planning. And so this project is bringing in larger spatial and temporal scales through the use of a landscape simulation model called ALCES Online. This is a screen capture from that modeling tool. It shows the study area that Adam referred to previously that was used by the human-wildlife coexistence technical working group. And we'll be looking at changes in land use and its effect on connectivity over both previous decades and into the future through this work. So this map here is showing Anthropogenic footprint within the study area. These are things such as settlement footprint in Canmore and Banff. Obviously, the Highway 1 corridor that goes through the valley, and also recreational development and some industrial developments. And these collectively cover about 5% of the study area today. That footprint has increased due to development in past decades. This map shows the increase in footprint in the study area over the past 6 decades, during which it's increased about 5-fold. And also during that similar period of time, the intensity of human use along these footprints, such as Highway 1, has increased. This map showing vehicle traffic along Highway 1 near Canmore over the past 6 decades, or 5 decades, sorry. We'll be looking at the effect of these footprints and associated human activity using a least cost corridor analysis. This will be applying an approach that's being used elsewhere, such as in Washington State, to look at wildlife connectivity, but incorporating research that has been conducted in the Bull Valley. Least cost corridor analysis is based on the concept that an animal moving through a region, so between patches, is going to encounter resistance that varies depending on habitat value, also barriers that could be encountered, and levels of human activity. And so the total cost associated with a path between patches is going to equal the cumulative cost or cumulative resistance that's encountered along that path. So this diagram here is just a hypothetical example to help demonstrate some of the key concepts here. We have 2 habitat patches on the left and right, and a corridor in between. In this hypothetical example, the habitat value in that corridor is varying, with the brighter green trees indicating higher levels of dispersal habitat value. And so in this example, we have higher connectivity in the lower portion of the corridor. If, however, a development such as a road isolates a portion of the corridor from the habitat patches, then the connectivity of that part of the corridor will decline. And so it's both the value, or the habitat value at a location, but also the location within the broader regional context that matters when we're talking about connectivity. So now I'm just going to go through some layers that we're preparing that will be used in the connectivity analysis. This is all, very early days in this work. This is a map of grizzly bear dispersal habitat, areas with security cover, and also food availability. So areas such as forested areas and alpine areas with vegetation have higher dispersal habitat value, as shown in the green. Areas that are barren and rocky, and also human footprints have lower dispersal habitat value. But permeability or connectivity is influenced not only by that dispersal habitat value, but also proximity to areas with human activity. So research from the Valley has shown that use of habitat is lower, and also risk of mortality is higher in proximity to features with human activities such as roads or settlements or recreational developments. And so in this map here of permeability, the value of the dispersal habitat is reduced in proximity to developments such as or footprints such as the highway going through the valley. Now, next step in developing this permeability layer will be to incorporate more detailed information on levels of human activity and its effect on permeability for grizzly bear. And then that permeability layer will be used as the input to the least cost corridor analysis, where we'll be assessing permeability not only locally, but looking at the cumulative resistance encountered between habitat patches. So next steps, in addition to refining the permeability layer and preparing the connectivity maps, will be to apply the connectivity model to a reconstruction of historical land use. So maps at different decades back through time of levels of human footprint, and then also simulating future connectivity under alternative development and mitigation scenarios that would be informed by the advisory committee. And as Adam mentioned, we are also considering the possibility of incorporating additional indicators with input from the advisory committee to look at things such as socioeconomic values that are affected by different mitigation scenarios. And that's where I'll leave it. I know that we're almost out of time here, but I'll be happy to answer any questions, but also please don't hesitate to reach out to me through this email address. Thank you.
You're on
Sorry,
mute,
I did
John.
not. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, John, you're on mute still.
Right, I gotta unmute my microphone. Sorry, I was actually looking to see the previous slide on your slide deck, but it seems to be gone, so unless you can bring that back.
I'll try.
Yeah, so so refined permeability. What's refined permeability mean?
It means just bringing in more detailed information on the assumptions that we're using to assess the ability of grizzly bear to move through a region. So one of the assumptions that is being made when we're looking at connectivity is that areas in proximity to areas of human activity have a lower permeability, and the degree to which permeability is reduced is affected by the level of human activity. It's not just a yes, no, but if you have more intense human activity, then the effect on permeability is going to be higher. And I don't yet have information on the intensity of human activity brought into the model, so that will be a next step.
Okay, thank you. And you also talked about mitigation scenarios. Could you think of any examples or just give us some idea of what a mitigation scenario is?
Yeah, so a mitigation scenario could be, it could be controls on levels of human activity in certain areas. Perhaps preventing human activity from areas that are identified as potentially important for connectivity. It could be modifying development plans. There could be any host of strategies that could be assessed. But I think the most important thing here is the idea of having an advisory committee that would inform what the mitigation scenarios should be that are going to be assessed.
So ALCES has done this sort of work in other regions, I'm pretty sure.
We do a lot of whether it's on human connectivity, wildlife connectivity, or other questions that can be addressed through scenario analysis, where we use simulations to look at the effectiveness of different management options. I mean, one thing that I think is really important is having organizations like advisory committees engaged early on in the process, so that people are comfortable and knowledgeable about the analysis approach.
I'll keep talking until I see somebody else's hand go up, but in regards to the effectiveness of the established corridors here, we just know from number of studies and firsthand experience that the corridors the functionality is compromised by number of people that are recreating in the corridors. So how might that play out in the work you're doing in the final report? What might come along in the way of recommendations or advice in regards to refining the permeability of the existing corridors?
Well, an example of an analysis that we can do through this project would be trying out a scenario where the level of recreational activity is reduced in an area that is important for connectivity, and seeing how the overall connectivity of the corridor increases compared to a scenario where recreational activity is not reduced.
Yeah, that enforcement side is a little tricky. So,
Yeah, I mean, yep. It's a very good point. I think the intent here is it's like a what if type analysis where we can demonstrate the benefits of different strategies, and then that hopefully can provide decision makers with information that's needed to implement.
I don't want to drone on about this, but it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't matter how effective a corridor is designed if humans just choose to ignore or disregard that corridor or the intent of the corridor, then the best laid plans, I see that these two things are hand in hand. We have to design really high functioning corridors, but we also have to make sure that people that live here accept the intent and honor the intent. So now I'm just sort of ranting, I guess, unless you have something brilliant to add into this conversation.
I don't, other than that, hopefully outcomes from this type of analysis can not only be useful for decision makers, but also for, education, informing the public of why these types of measures are important.
Great, thanks for that thought. Councillor Comfort, I see you there.
Yeah, I'm just curious now that the decision's been made and that's not subject to any kind of appeal. If different groups or communities find the corridor to be insufficient to provide for wildlife movement, adequate wildlife movement, what can be done to mitigate that? Or is that it? Game over, we're done talking?
I'm wondering if it's probably Adam. Do you want to address this question?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I got booted out there for a little while. But I did catch the question. I think, okay, sorry. I think that ends up being a question of the planning process municipally. So whatever whatever the data indicates is the the news that we follow at our organization. That's our MO. And we have that liberty as well. And so I would hope that council would explore whatever authority it has and whatever position it has to make the decisions in the best interest of the community, as you always do. So so I think our job is to present the data, and it's sort of council's job to figure out what to do with that data.
Perfect.
Well said. So, and my other question is, can you talk a little bit to how important this part of the landscape is to that whole notion of the wildlife, the wildlife bridge in North America, like for the community, for that big of a scope?
Like the continent scale.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, for sure. So so as Hillary sort of drew on earlier, that she showed that map of the historical ranges of a variety of species, and how much smaller a lot of those ranges have become over time. And if you show sort of an intermediary map between those two, what you see is a bunch of chicken pox. You see dots everywhere. And that was as roads got built, as a variety of disturbances happened, a lot more populations got a lot more isolated. And then those isolated populations become extremely vulnerable to additional stress or change, or even just time, because they themselves are vulnerable. So when you have these isolated populations, they tend to disappear over time. So the idea of connectivity is that you may only ever have a certain number of grizzlies, right? There may only ever be 3 or 4 grizzlies that use the Bow Valley in a given period of time. But their genetic information means that they actually have, or their ability to move means that their genetic information is shared with a much bigger population and a much bigger land area. And because we have a relatively intact ecosystem from Yellowstone all the way up to the Yukon, we actually have this incredible opportunity to maintain that flow of genetic information. No single animal ever walks, other than Karsten Hoyer, walks from Yellowstone to the Yukon. But their genetic information does over time and over generations and over these incremental movements. So any fracture in that movement pattern, any break, means that suddenly you've separated populations of animals. You've made it impossible for their genes to be shared. You've made both sides of that divide more vulnerable to change, especially in a context of climate change, where we don't have all the information about how it will impact things. One thing we do know is that animals are going to need to move to adapt to that change as it happens. And if they can't do that, they're not going to survive.
Thank you.
We're going to have to move on pretty quick here. I do have one last question, and I'm not sure if it'd be better answered by Mr. Leonard or Mr. Carlson, but the question is, with your understanding of the Bow Valley and the town of Canmore at this time, do you think it's likely that the scenario modeling will project a future that is still supportive of continued development? I don't know which one of you want to jump in on that.
I'll take that if
Okay.
that's okay with that one. Well, as I said, we're not going to draw recommendations. So the data is seldom so clear that it will say, here's the line, it's over at this point. Other than, you build a wall across the valley. It's not ever that absolute. So I think it's a matter of showing the range of likely outcomes for a range of likely scenarios. So it is all a little bit hypothetical. And when we show, or when it shows, you know, foreseeable future developments, it will show, like I said, the range of likely impacts of that development. It's not likely to say this can't happen.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I'll move on now. I do want to emphasize something I've been saying to Dr. Young and I think Mr. Leonard on this project that has been in planning stage for a long time. I'm really, really nervous about this, the work that's being done in the valley here. If all of our municipal neighbors and both the provincial and federal parks and the Stoney Nakoda are not actively involved, I think we really have to have the full involvement of all those other parties to have an effective analysis. Although, what do I know? Because I've never seen one before. In any case, thanks very much for both of you for being here and presenting. I know we'll have a number of conversations about this in the future, and I'll look forward to seeing the work as it rolls out, and we'll certainly have a discussion at the town around how we can be involved.
Great. I appreciate that.
Thanks for your
Thank you
time.
very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care. So at this point, I'll look to the minutes of the April 21st, 2020 Committee of the Whole meeting. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move the minutes be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to staff reports. Item D1, the Undermining Review Regulations. Mr. Sarte.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I am here today to present on updates, provincial updates to undermining review regulations. I'm just going to share my screen, and Mr. Mayor, if you can let me know when you can see that, I'll proceed.
Don't see it yet. Yep, there it is.
Okay. This past April 1st, a new undermining review regulation came into force, and this replaces a previous undermining review regulation. This presentation is going to provide an overview of those updates. Let's skip to slide there. Okay, in 1997, the province brought into force 3 regulations in response to concerns around undermining liability on what are now referred to as the regulated lands. So these were lands referenced in the NRCB decision. These 3 regulations provided a framework for exempting and indemnifying the town from liability and outlined how technical reviews would be undertaken on undermined lands prior to development. These regulations also included provisions that would require a developer to maintain insurance to protect the province and others from losses. As a result of those regulations, there's a requirement in there that an undermining indemnity agreement would be signed between the province and the town. And in 1999, that agreement was signed and came into force. Fast forward to May 2010, and we had a sinkhole form under a municipal pathway on MR lands in Durgas Gate. The town expected from our agreements that we'd be protected from loss, but we found that the insurance was in place and it was only enforced until the lands were transferred over to the town. The developer at that time, I believe, was in receivership or entering receivership. And the indemnity agreement that was signed in 1999 specified losses as those that occur for the town based on claims by third parties. And so that's to say, if we were to get a claim, we would have the costs of defending that claim and any compensation covered by the province. So we weren't protected for this particular type of loss, this direct loss. The province in this case did provide a special grant to remediate the sinkhole. However, that was just for the costs, the physical costs of remediation. And we were advised that there's no assurance that such a grant would be available in the future. And so this raised a number of concerns for us. It appears that residents and the town are assuming full risks for undermining loss if the regulation is followed in most cases. Insurance and assurances from the developer that were required as part of the regulation weren't as lasting in the way that they were regulated. And there's concern for the study and mitigation standards for the municipal infrastructure and lands. There is a very high standard for structures, and we've seen a lot of success with mitigation of structures out on those lands. However, what are the standards for municipal infrastructure? And the updated regulations do address a number of these concerns, not all of them. The indemnity and liability regulations were left as is, as was the indemnity agreement. And the province has indicated they don't have an appetite to revisit those. They have, however, updated the undermining review regulation, which focuses on the way that lands are studied and mitigated. And I'll touch on a few of the three more material changes that occurred in that regulation review update. And that's the insurance requirements, report and certification requirements, and the guidelines. So first, for insurance requirements, originally it was an insurance that was with the developer. Now they've specified minimum coverage required to be carried by the engineers and geoscientists involved in the studies. And so that's a 5 million minimum coverage per claim and in the aggregate. And the developer as well is required to maintain a general liability insurance. And this is to cover their time involvement in the development plus 2 years. So now we have specific requirements that will allow that insurance to survive a handover of the land. The insurance certificates are required to be submitted to the province annually. In terms of report requirements, this reflects a desire to have reports and certification done at each stage of development. And so starting with when you're looking at an overall area, there will be a report and a certificate at subdivision and for each individual development project. And the guidelines, there are a couple key changes with the guidelines, and this is a separate document to the regulation that was adopted at the same time. And these requirements are laid out in this flow chart here. And essentially it's looking at the different requirements at each phase of development, as I've described. And as well, it's moved to a risk-based, probabilistic approach. And that's to say, for example, for a structure, what is the risk that it will settle sufficiently to cause some issue to arise with the development within a specified period of time? Together with those specified allowable settlements, we've included requirements for deep utilities, shallow utilities, pathways, and roads. So now we have specific requirements for that municipal infrastructure, as well as including the same stringent life loss risk requirements that we included in the municipal development plan for steep creeks. So how do these changes impact the protections that the community and the town have from loss on the designated lands in particular? Well, there is risk. If there's settlements of lands that damage structures or infrastructure, we're quite likely at risk of having to bear the cost for that damage. If it's the type of settlement that it would occur within an engineer's report assessment of the risk of settlement. However, there are additional protections as I've described. The insurance requirements are expanded and they're more clearly defined. This 2-seal approach where we have an engineer or geoscientist sign off on both the initial study and also to certify that the study has been conducted in accordance with the guidelines is now required at each stage of development. And we have clarified for the definition and reduction of risk. So very specific requirements around what settlements are tolerable and expanding that to include municipal infrastructure. So to conclude, undermining risk is different than some of our other risks, but in a lot of ways it's similar. With the collaborative approach we've had with TSMV and the province to update the review regulation, we feel that work has been done to more clearly define the process. It's a robust process for assessing and reducing those risks, and feel that the outcomes are to take those risks, reduce them to a point that's consistent with other risks that we experience in the community, steep creeks, settlement of soils, the types of risks that you're going to see in other areas. It's allowing for that to be reduced to a similar level. I'll now open it up for questions.
Thanks very much. And through this conversation and several leading up to this, I'm often reminded of the very similar discussions we've had over the years around identifying and modifying risk up at Cougar Creek project, for instance. And council years ago learned all about ALARP, risk that was as low as reasonably possible. And at that time, we talked about, and we still talk about in the Cougar Creek project, recognize the fact that we can't eliminate risk entirely, but through engineering studies and development of infrastructure, we can reduce the risk up by the creek as low as reasonably possible. And I understand this work to be very similar in that nature. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the whole ALARP thing?
Yeah, it is fairly similar. There's been extensive work done to, similar to the Steep Creeks, assess what is the hazard. So understanding where are the mines located, how deep are they, what's the nature of the mining, is it vertical seams versus horizontal, are there air shafts? We have a fairly extensive record that's been developed over the long life of the mines and in the 40 plus years since the mines have ceased operation. That's come at a big expense. There's thousands of drill holes out in the undermined lands. 3D mapping's been put together. And for each project, more work is needed, more holes will be drilled. So that helps you define the risk. And then there's a good technical body of knowledge around how do you mitigate for that risk? What type of settlements could you expect based on a mitigated coal seam, for example? And based on that, you can design structures that'll accommodate those settlements. And it's been successfully used as an approach over the last 25 years to do quite significant amounts of development around the community. The step that's taken here is to fill in some of the gaps. The settlements we've seen and the issues we've seen have arisen around municipal infrastructure on the regulated lands. It's come where we have water utilities close by to mitigated vertical workings or shafts. So I think by raising the standard for municipal infrastructure and for the study of those lands and the mitigation of those lands, that'll help address some of the issues we've seen in more recent history.
Councillor Stanford, I know you have a question just before we go there. Could you speak briefly then, Mr. Sarte, about how this affects residential properties that are in Three Sisters in those lands that may have undermining issues?
That may have in the future?
Well, you know, a review of current situation for people that live in homes in the undermined areas or up in that part of town, and then how the planning moves forward into the future for residential and other structures.
For developed properties up there, a lot of them have been developed based on these guidelines already. These were the best practices that have been adopted by Golder, who's responsible for a lot of the studies that have been done, the majority of the studies that have been done for TSMV up in that area. And so it was a formalizing of that best practice approach of using that risk model to determine potential future settlements and then to mitigate from there. So I don't have any concern for developed private property being well outside of these updated guidelines. In terms of going forward, we'd like to adopt this as a consistent approach across all undermined lands, not just those in the regulated areas, and are in the process of reviewing what that would look like in terms of updating our engineering guidelines for non-regulated lands.
I recall when Durgas Gate sinkhole opened up, it had been characterized by some as effectively as a successful experience, because before development in that area, it had been identified that this was a potentially more risky area, and so intentionally there wasn't any residential or structures built. It was left undeveloped and just used for a trail. And do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it was very intentionally done. They were aware of the presence of the air shaft. They mitigated it with filter fabric, and I think was an approach that was, they went into it knowing that there was that risk. Now, going forward, is that an appropriate risk to take? We've said no. Going forward, we'd like to see a pathway on a municipal reserve mitigated to a much higher standard. In that case, we would have likely wanted to get down and mitigate at bedrock, which is about 10 meters down. Do that prior to the development, because that was a big complicating factor in that case, is that we can't get down to bedrock to mitigate once you have development around it. So I'd say it was a decision made with intent historically, but going forward, we wouldn't make that decision. We'd mitigate to a higher standard.
Thank you. Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. Thank you, Mr. Sarte, for your presentation. I'm reading your staff report, and in it, it indicates that a lot of the onus is on the engineers. It's a double sign process. And it states that each engineer involved is required to have in place errors and omissions insurance for a period of 10 years. Is that something that's common in the engineering world, that an engineer would carry such insurance?
It is. Yeah.
So you wouldn't have any problem finding engineers to provide this oversight, because most engineers would carry such a insurance?
I think something like 8 years is more typical, but the insurance requirements were reviewed with input from Golder, and they agreed that those were insurance requirements that could be met by their providers.
So if anybody was going to do this oversight, they would have to have that and demonstrate they have it.
Correct.
That they could do this job. And then it goes on to say that the affected parties would need to take action against the engineers if there was a negative impact based on something that was perhaps the liability of the engineer. So it takes the municipality out of the equation then?
But potentially. So firstly, there could be an action against the municipality, and that would drag us into a situation. The intent of the regulation is that we're not necessarily involved in the approval process from an undermining perspective. We've been pulled out of that equation. So our concern is someone might say, you've approved this development, you're responsible for the undermining damage. And the regulation really was intended to say, if that happens, if there's a claim against the town, the province will defend against that claim and compensate for any losses that the municipality may occur. And you are not required to be involved in an approval process from an undermining perspective on private property. Now, one of our residual concerns here is that if there is a situation where there is a settlement, albeit if the regulations follow, the probability is low. If there is a situation where damage to a resident home occurs, the obligation is on them to hire a lawyer and go after and prove that there's been errors or omissions. And so that potentially could be a very impactful situation for a private resident. And we know firsthand that when we were involved in that situation, trying to get an insurer to compensate, trying to get the developer to address it, trying to get the province to step up, that it's a big cost and a big impact. So that is a residual concern. We can use these regulations to mitigate the risks, but the question that remains is what happens when something occurs.
And so would this simplify the process, do you think?
This provides additional protection that if it's clear that there's been an error or there's been negligence on the part of the engineer, there's more assurance that insurance will be in place. There's general liability insurance with the developer for up to 2 years after the development. So there's a clear path to recourse, but there's still a bar that needs to be crossed there to demonstrate that negligence or that liability. And so I anticipate if there is an issue, if and when something crops up, it'll, just as with Durgas Gate, it's challenging and messy, and depending on the nature, expensive.
Thank you.
See, Councillor Steele has a question. Just before we go there, I have a follow-up question also in regards to the insurance, and I'm looking at section 10 of their regulation, which is about insurance. And 10.1 notes that the professional engineers must maintain this level of insurance, and it's noted in amount of at least $5 million per claim. And what does it mean per claim? Because this is long before there's any claims in the sense of insurance.
Yeah. So it'll be, I'm not an insurance expert. I've asked a few questions of folks who are better informed. The insurance requires a minimum coverage of 5 million per claim or in the aggregate. And the way I understand that will work is that for each project, an engineer will be responsible for each contract. The intent of the regulation is that an engineer will have an insurance policy in place specific to that particular development. That development can be one building, it could be multiple buildings, and that insurance coverage will be for the entirety of that contract and development. There could be a single claim or multiple claims associated with that policy. And the minimum coverage for each individual claim or for the claims in aggregate is 5 million. So there could be multiple claims adding up to 5 million or a single claim adding up to 5 million. That isn't 100% clear from the regulation, and so is an area going forward we'll look for some clarity, but based on the reading of the regulation by our lawyer and their insurance staff, that's our understanding of the intent of the regulation.
It'd be nice to have it clear because it seems unclear to me in an amount of at least $5 million, but so bottom end, but
It
What's
it
the
will likely
vote?
be for 5 million, if
Yeah.
it says at least.
For a period of 10 years, so I don't say it's a 60-unit development project. Would each separate lot constitute a potential claim, in which case they'd need 60 times 5 million, or?
No, my understanding is that that single development will be one contract with the engineer, and for that contract, the engineer will need a policy. Now, those 60 units can claim in as one claim, as it would often be the case with common property. They would have a single claim. If it was multiple buildings and somehow with the management structure they had, they each put in a claim, or there were multiple claims for whatever reason, that's where the in aggregate would come in, and the cap or minimum would apply. So it would be 5 million for an individual claim, or 5 million for multiple claims from the same development.
Okay, I guess we'll learn to understand that more fully in the future. But it is interesting to note that the same wording essentially for the insurance that the developer must maintain. Although instead of being 5 million per claim, it's 5 million per occurrence. And what's the difference, do you think, between a claim and an occurrence?
An occurrence can lead to multiple claims, is my
Okay.
understanding.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Seeley.
Following up on the same question, the 10-year period of time. I imagine there'll be notes on title, buyer beware, but who's responsible beyond that 10-year period?
The province is responsible for all things with respect to the regulation. So the province is responsible for ensuring that a insurance certificate is submitted each year. They're responsible for ensuring that the undermining reports are registered on title. The town doesn't have a role in undermining. It explicitly says in the regulation that the town has no role. Our role is largely focused around ensuring that the work is done properly. We're essentially a buyer of municipal lands and infrastructure. And so as any other buyer, we need to be doing our due diligence before we receive those lands and that infrastructure, and in the design of those lands and that infrastructure. Beyond the 10 years, there is, that's essentially a statute of limitations for liability for the engineering work. And we're in a situation then where there really is no recourse for an owner, property owner. If there's undermining on the land, that's a risk that's assumed by them. And if they're not directly insured for that type of damage to their home, they could end up in a situation where they're responsible for the full costs, and that's no different than today. That's the current situation on all of the existing development.
It'll remain on title though, so they'll know that they're buying a house that has been mitigated.
The undermining report and certificate will remain on title in perpetuity.
Thank you.
It's really interesting to note that in the regulations, there's some overview reports for every stage of development, both the area structure plan and subdivision, and then right down to the project planning. So that seems really comprehensive in nature. Was it that comprehensive in the old regulation? I didn't bother getting it out to look at it.
Yeah, it may not have been as formally defined, but there were, the developer has a need to understand the lands that they're looking to develop at the area level, to try to identify which lands to avoid, which lands to put higher or lower or medium density, different structure types. All of that's influenced by the cost of mitigation. So they're looking to see, okay, this area is going to cost a lot, so we probably would want higher value return on that, or this is really expensive, maybe we just avoid that area. So that approach has been used by TSMV from day one. And by the time you get down to the individual development, you're really looking at recommendations around the foundation types, for example. And so that's been the standard practice. It's just now clearly defined and turned into a requirement.
Great, thank you. And the reports that are referenced in those sections, I assume that those reports are shared publicly?
They're made available on request. They can be requested from the province, and we're also looking at putting together a database. We do have access to, we have all of those reports in our library, so if they're requested, we make them available.
I see. Great, thank you. Any questions from other members of council? Councillor Hillstead.
Thank you, Mr. Sarte, for your presentation. Would this be a kind of similar, not sure how they do it, where like if you have an earthquake zone, because I'm assuming they'll have some kind of similar process. It won't be the same because it's earthquakes versus undermining, but would there be a similar thing with that? Like, is that, how would that work exactly? Just have a comparison, just as that's the only other kind of situation I can think of really, that you're looking at damage to a building that it could happen. Will it necessarily happen? Earthquakes are probably more likely to, depending on where you live. So how's that
What are the
work?
consequences if it happens?
Yeah.
Very, very similar. In fact, it was something that we referenced in developing the guidelines was earthquake requirements, and they look at different timeframes for earthquakes. So what's the risk of a 500-year earthquake happening? And that helped us establish the time frame we were looking for settlement within a certain period of time. It's a very similar parallel. A lot of geotechnical risks are risk of settlement of soils, for example. We're often building buildings on soils that could settle just in the same way as undermined lands. And so you study and analyze that and determine what your risk of settlement is and build your foundations accordingly. So it's very, very similar to other building approaches. It just needs a unique set of guidelines because the way you would assess undermining is different than earthquakes. But again, similar approaches looking at managing and mitigating risk, not necessarily eliminating it, but determining what's an acceptable risk to take for the developments that you're doing.
Thank you.
Are there other questions this time from members of council? Councillor Mara.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. Thank you, Mr. Sarte, for your report. I just had a question regarding if a development was halfway and the developer ceased to exist, then who would be responsible for any issues?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Liability-wise, who would be responsible if the developer ceased to exist halfway through the project?
Good question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know, Mr. Soto, if you've dealt with this for just open excavations with what happened in 08, 09.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Mara. The definition of developer was expanded here to actually end up including the owner. So I'm not sure that I'm going to answer your question, but I'll expand it, because if similar to a receivership, for example, if a development was in process and the developer went into receivership, then a receiver takes over the lands. At some point, the developer walks away from a development and it's now a bunch of individual owners, right? So both the developer and the engineers have to carry the insurance requirement. However, the owner now has the liability that's limited by insurance. After the 10-year period, it's actually the owner's responsibility. And if the owner was to add on to their structure or modify their structure in some way, you know, in the future, we can envision maybe densification of some of those lands where single detached dwelling units eventually come down and duplex units go up, for example. And all of that would then transfer to the owner, and there's an obligation on the owner to do further study to make sure that their structure can be expanded. And then there would be a new statute of limitations for a new, there'd be a new undermining report prepared, a new engineer's report, and a double stamp requirement. I'm not sure if I actually got to your question or not.
Yeah, yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there questions at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation, Mr. Asarte.
Thank you.
That I'll move on to item D2, which is a verbal report on pandemic response update. Ms. DeSoto, is that you?
Yes, it is. And I have nothing prepared. I'm sorry. We had a workshop with council earlier today, and my intent was to not present anything publicly today. We have a presentation publicly scheduled for next Wednesday at your special council meeting on a follow-up from the financial committee motion. And that's what we've been spending the bulk of our time preparing and working on. I apologize for that. That's my error, but I'm certainly open to answering any questions that council may have of any actions that have over the last couple of weeks.
Okay, great, thanks very much. I know there's lots going on right now. If you could speak at all to some of the planning that we've been completing towards changing the movement on Main Street, the pedestrian movement, and making Main Street a safer place for people to walk. Is there something you can, is that any further along from the last presentation?
No, so that last presentation was made a week ago today, and that was leading up to the long weekend. I think at that time, Dr. Cottle referenced that the BIA wanted to sort of collect information from the business owners after the long weekend to review what worked, what didn't work, and then there would be some follow-up meetings that would occur this week, and potentially decisions made later in the week about future weekends. So that has not occurred yet. But you anticipate further discussion with the BIA and other business association members this week.
Okay, thanks very much. Are there any questions from councillors? Seeing none, thanks very much. We'll move on then to item E1, councillor updates. And as usual, I'll just open the floor. Anybody that has a question for another councillor can just raise their hand. I just wanted to add one brief note on my report, which was written, I guess, about a week ago. Since writing that report, I've done 10 or 11 additional interviews on radio, television, and with the press. So we continue to be sharing message with the regional public as much as possible. Just a, yeah. Oh, Councillor Comfort.
So I have a question about that. I think it's very difficult to ascertain what a clear message is that's being delivered. So on the part of the province, for example, they say, enjoy your weekend, spend the time with your family and friends, but don't travel unnecessarily. So there's sort of conflicting messages, confusing messages. I think we're doing a pretty good job of saying, really, if you have no reason to come or to travel, you shouldn't be traveling. It's still kind of blurred. Can we count on getting more help from the province on delivering a clear message?
Well, my understanding, Ms. DeSoto wants to jump in, but I think the province was more clear last week when they announced that businesses could reopen, and Dr. Hinshaw certainly allowed as how people could take they could travel more broadly now, although not outside of the province. And she did very clearly indicate that second homeowners can travel to their second homes. I know, Ms. DeSoto, did you want to weigh in on that question?
No, only to add that the province has made it clear that it's not a public health order. They're not restricting movement of Albertans by way of public health order. So some of what we've been interpreting the travel message to mean is interprovincial travel or beyond day travel, but if you can take a drive or take a walk in a neighborhood that's not your own and then return to your neighborhood, that travel itself is not being restricted in any way.
Okay. Thanks.
But I recognize what you're saying, that it's, there have been contradictory messages, it seems, over time, and it's not always evident exactly what the intent is from the province. But we have had very clear input around, well, we've talked about this before, you know, having to balance people's personal rights with public health orders, and anything that wasn't subject to a specific order or regulation was left to interpretation, I guess. And just to that point, I actually had a comment for Councillor Seeley's report. Councillor Seeley, you noted that parks are open, but non-essential travel restrictions are still in effect. And you say that changed May 8th to allow travel to second homes. I just want to note that travel to second homes actually never was restricted. It wasn't encouraged, but it was never restricted.
Right. I think what I meant to say was travel to other provinces was, yeah, I'm not sure what I meant there.
Okay.
Point taken.
Yeah. Councillor Sanford, you mentioned the audited financial statements for Bow Valley Waste Management Commission, and of course, I'm assuming you didn't say otherwise, but it was a clean opinion, I'm sure.
Yes. I thought I mentioned that they were approved, and yes, they were a clean opinion.
Great, that's good to hear. Thanks. Councillor McCallum, I had a question around the Bow Valley Regional Housing. You know, the reserves will be replenished. Well, new budget shows an operating deficit of just over 600,000, which will be addressed through a combination of general operating reserve and other non-restricted reserves. And these reserves will be replenished through requisitions, which will be stretched over several years. So I take that as a heads up that the town of Canmore should be planning for increased requisitions or from BVRH to replenish their reserves.
Yes, Mayor Borman, that will happen, but I don't think it's going to, as in past, when we've looked to replenish reserves for, say, the FF&E for phase 1, et cetera, it wasn't something that we replenished in one shot. We did it over several years to provide a more smoothing effect. And in past, it's also happened to blend with reduces in expenses overall. So it wasn't as noticeable as we thought it might be.
Okay, that's good to hear. Do you happen to have off the top of your head the projected reserve balance at the end of the year, or, you know, reflecting the projected operating deficit?
I do not. I know that you gave me the courtesy of a heads up that you were going to ask me that question. I sent that question to Ian last night and I don't have it back yet, but I will forward it to council and admin when I receive it.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Great. Thanks very much. Anybody with questions, put your hands up. The also in the report from Councillor McCallum on Bow Valley Regional Transit, the 5th bullet point down or so references an acronym that I'm not familiar
Oh,
with.
sorry.
CUTA.
Yeah, Canadian Union of Transportation Association, something like that, CUTA. It's basically like the FCM of transit.
Okay. And they're looking for some operational funding from the feds?
Yes, they have been. There's been a huge call from municipalities in the U.S. to the U.S. Federal Reserve to help municipalities with transit. It's interesting, and I never really thought about it when this was shared with us. Is that WestJet and Air Canada, both who are non-essential services, are receiving large sums of money from the federal government to keep going, and yet transit is being left in the dark throughout the country. So that's sort of the point that's being made is, hey, we are actually an essential services. We're getting doctors and frontline workers and nurses to their jobs, and getting commerce continues as a result of these essential services. You need to help underpin us and not leave it to the taxpayer.
Okay, well, thanks for that update. Any other questions from other councillors? Seeing none, we'll move on to item F1, the service area reports. Look for questions from council for CAO's office or municipal services. Councillor Comfort.
Sorry. So I just had a question about item I. As part of the food pillar, that there's a note that a person was appointed food lead. I just wondered who that person is.
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head. I can find out and get back to you. It might have been Megan Emery.
Yeah.
Is there if you need to be connected, are you trying to make a connection between people? Is that what you're looking for?
No, I just have a question about how the coordination's going, because I had a report unsubstantiated that there were some issues in the distribution and so forth. So I just wondered, it may be that they need some more assistance. And that was from like a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, go ahead.
So I gather it's a big beast to sort of wrestle to the ground, right? And a lot of connections to make, but just wondered how it's going, I guess is what I.
Sure. The main contact for that would be Lisa Brown, and she will be presenting to council next week. Her proposal for this budget and this program will be in front of council at your May 27th meeting. So I will let her know and ask her to speak to that at that presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I have a question under recreation services. So item C, and in regards to the report on the Eagles Hockey Club and their issues they're experiencing because of COVID. And it talks about the report notes that administration will be doing a number of things to help work with the Eagles. And I'm trying to remember when council approved the last agreement that affected the relationship with the Eagles, all of the work falling out of that agreement was left to administration. So the work that's being taken now in regards to extending their deferred ice rental balance and everything else, that's within the domain of administration, correct?
Yes.
So there's no expectation that this has to come back to council because it's outside of the
I see.
agreement.
Right. I think in normal times, if the Eagles were just missing a payment, absolutely, this would be coming back to council for approval. But given the closure of our facility and the pandemic response, I think the intent of putting this in the service area report is to let council know it's happening and that we are sticking to the spirit of the agreement, but recognizing the impact of the pandemic and working with them to acknowledge, they can't run they don't have a revenue source. So we're shifting it within the spirit of the agreement. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yep, I'm just putting it out there for councillor awareness and input. Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. So, Dr. Cottle, does that mean that we're extending the same, I'm guessing that we're extending the same sort of courtesy to all of our partners right now that are in the exact same boat that the Eagles are, the daycare, gymnastics?
Within the context of recreation, it's really only two user groups, sport groups.
Right.
But yes, I think the reason why it's highlighted here is because we do have a council approved agreement with the Eagles, but absolutely the gymnastics club, the skating club, Soho swim club, they're all in the same boat. And so we're working in an equal spirit with all of those recreation partners.
That's what I expected, and I thought I would have heard loud and clear if that wasn't happening. So I just wanted to confirm. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question under engineering services regarding the tender for construction for Cougar Creek project, which closed May 7th. Is there any update or more details on that, Ms. DeSoto or Ms. Smithers?
Yeah, I can.
Or anyone?
So the tender has closed, as you've said. We are working with evaluating the bids right now and looking at choosing a successful proponent. At that point, I have talked with Mr. Asarte about him providing an update to council at one of your upcoming meetings, just on the status of the project, just given its magnitude and profile. I think it would be worth at that point in the process, which is the next kind of major milestone, it would be worth providing an update back to council. So that,
great.
Stay tuned.
Okay. Is it safe to assume if the tenders were not as anticipated, we would have heard more?
Potentially. Yes, it's safe.
No news is good news. Okay.
Well, this
How
is
I'm gonna
being
take it.
recorded, so.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking 7 years in now. 7 years next month. Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I had a question just after that about the washrooms that are now open in Canmore. Apparently there was only one open in downtown, a public washroom in Canmore. And now that the parks are having more users, like the tennis courts are open now, are some of the park washrooms going to be open as well?
We do have currently the vault toilets, with the exception of the one out in Three Sisters, open. They opened on Friday, and the reason they were closed is we needed to do a new job hazard assessment to make sure that our staff had the proper PPE and training to clean them. Protocols had changed under the pandemic. Those are open. They opened as of Friday. The other washrooms, so the ones in like Lions Park, Millennium Park, Eagle Run, the Opera House, those ones, they've not been opened yet. And the reason for that is, simply put, we don't have the budget to keep them open. We would need to clean them approximately 4 times a day. And aside from kind of equipment, sanitizing equipment, etc., to have available to keep them clean, we just do not have the staff resources currently to provide that level of service.
And is there any indication when they might be open? Are we looking at opening them this summer?
Not at this point. As Ms. DeSoto mentioned in our workshop this morning, there are so many unknowns right now in the current situation. I think that, as with even like the parks and trails, for example, we're consistently revisiting the openings or modifications that we need to make. So we would certainly, I would imagine, over the course of the summer, come back to some of the washroom decisions, but the cost is first and foremost a limiting factor for us right now.
And is that to do with the park staff that isn't being hired for the summer? Like we're downsizing our park staffing?
Some of it is related to the heated kind of washrooms that aren't the vault ones are actually maintained by facilities. So some of it is related to the fact that we've let go some of the cleaning contracts because we wanted to keep our staff working, and we've also had some staff layoffs recently in facilities. So yeah, some of it is definitely a resourcing issue. And Mr. Soto, I don't know if you had, I saw your hand up there.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add that the use of our fields and courts are more of a passive use now and an individual play use as opposed to team play and tournament play, which is when the washrooms see their heaviest use. So when there's actual events that last the duration of a day, like a tournament, for example, or if there's teams playing a competitive game, and that's when we see the washrooms used most heavily, and none of that use has been permitted. So as Ms. Smithers mentioned, we will constantly evaluate and have to do that balancing of social benefit versus cost to determine when and how we should open.
Okay, thank you.
It's been interesting to watch the washroom out back of where I live, the vault toilet in the Mineside Park. Because as you noted, there's a staff coming by every day or more than once a day to clean it. It's quite a rigmarole. They get on the full hazmat suit from head to toe. I mean, it takes them, I'm going to say, 10 minutes to get into the suit to go in and clean that small washroom, and then they have to come out and take all of that equipment off again. So yeah, I can see one of the restrictions on that. On the other hand, it is important that we do everything we can to get our parks fully functional, including washrooms, I guess. So maybe that'll be part of our ongoing discussions around budget coming up. I have a question under, I think it's also under recreation or under facilities. So there's a note about elevation place pool water leaks. It notes that several different kinds of water leaks and associated damage have been observed in the public areas and mechanical rooms. Has that been going on for some time, or is that just recently?
I don't know is the short answer. I do know that as part of the annual maintenance and draining the pool, as we've indicated previously, we've taken advantage of the facility closures to go in and do the annual cleaning. And it was during that and just the overall inspection of the facility that these items were noted. So I don't know if it's ones that have been flagged in the past and they've just persisted when we've expected them by now, or if they're new issues. But that's where, as we get more information, we'll be able to provide more of an update to council. We have hired experts to come in and do a thorough examination to determine the cause of the leaks.
Okay, I'll be curious to follow that. Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from any councillors in regards to service area reports? See none, I'll look to council resolution action list. Are there any questions, comments on that? Seeing none, I believe I will now move that the committee of the whole be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned. See y'all around.